Thank you for everybody that's here. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Layla Corey. I'm the Creative Engagement Coordinator at Spaces. To ID my appearance, I'm a 28, starting today, year-old Arab American person wearing a gray t-shirt, glasses, and I have the Spaces front desk behind me. And I ID my appearance in consideration to blind or visually impaired folks dropping in for the call. And you're also all welcome to do the same when we open the floor. And I'm excited to introduce our current artist in residence, Martha Poggioli. Her exhibit, The Origin of Form, is on view right now at Spaces Gund Gallery through June 4th. Martha's residency was supported both in research and production by Sears ThinkBox and the Dittrick Museum of Medical History at Case Western Reserve University. And so we're also joined in conversation with ThinkBox Director Jim McGuffin-Cawley, Department Administrator Ruth D'Amelia, Director of Prototyping, Art and Community Engagement Ainsley Buckner, as well as the Dittrick Medical History Center's Chief Curator Amanda Nahoney. We may also be joined by the Dittrick's Archivist and Museum Registrar, Jennifer K. Neves, excuse me. So I'd like to start off by saying that Spaces recognizes the land upon which our building resides as the ancestral homeland of the Haudenosaunee and other Great Lakes tribes. We further acknowledge the thousands of Indigenous people who now call this region home as a result of forced migration, dispossession of ancestral homelands and territories, or other reasons. We affirm their right as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. We make this statement recognizing that intentionally or not, we have participated in ongoing settler colonialism, a term that is generally recognized to mean the removal, erasure, and supplantation of Indigenous peoples. We commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. About us, Spaces is the resource and public forum for artists who explore and experiment. We are the only alternative art organization in Ohio that solely commissions new artist projects, serving as a national model for how to materialize artists' ideas and interact with audiences. Our success is rooted in providing artists the kind of support rarely seen outside major institutions, which has led to ambitious new projects that have reached an international stage and expanded artists' practices. For those of you who are new or returning to Jitsi, please find instructions on how to use the platform in the group chat, which is located by clicking the speech bubble icon at the bottom left of the screen. Sometimes you have to shake your mouse for it to come up. We'd like to get an idea of who's joining us, and opening the group chat will also prompt you to assign yourself a display name. If you'd like to leave questions or comments for our speakers throughout the call, you can drop them in the chat or hold them for our Q&A portion of the event. Martha has expressed that she will welcome any number of questions during her presentation, so I will moderate those. Whatever you send there is going to be visible to everybody, but if you'd like to message someone privately, you can do that in the chat as well. If you know anyone who would be interested in joining the call, the easiest way to invite them is just by copying and pasting the URL and sending it to them by email or text. And finally, this talk will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel as well as our website. So if you prefer not to be recorded, you can keep your camera turned off. We ask that in the chat, just right beneath all of the Jitsi instructions, you'll find a questionnaire that we ask of our visitors if are exhibiting virtual programming. So if you could please fill that out, that would be great. You'll also find Martha's exhibit information. So if you haven't already, please mute your microphone by clicking the microphone icon at the bottom center of your screen. As a moderator, I can also mute you out of courtesy to our speakers. And to be able to speak after I mute you, you would just have to unmute yourself manually. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it first to Martha, if you'd like to take a few minutes to introduce yourself, and then to ThinkBox and Dittrick staff to tell us a bit about your orgs and your involvement in Martha's residency. And then Martha will go into her talk in earnest.
Thanks, Layla. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I can introduce myself, though I can possibly expand a bit on it when I begin my presentation. But I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to build this exhibition around the three institutions. And also another institution which has as yet remained unnamed, which is the Kohler Arts Industry Residency, which formed an enormous part of this this project that's on display at Spaces right now. Firstly, happy birthday to Layla. Thanks for doing this on your birthday. Where should I begin? I'm an artist. I'm Australian born. I've been in the United States since 2017, and I'm based out of Chicago. I'll launch into maybe a more in-depth spiel after we give the others an opportunity to introduce their organizations.
So maybe ThinkBox can go next. So I'm just going to make a couple comments on behalf of everybody who's here from ThinkBox. So ThinkBox is a facility on the campus at Case Western Reserve University. It's a university-wide facility that's also open to the public. We've been open to the public since we first began. It's, like I said, a 7-story, 50,000 square foot building. There's 3 full floors that are probably the ones that are most relevant to the artist community: a design floor, a prototyping floor, and a fabrication floor. Lots of tools to work in metals, in wood, in polymers, and everybody's frozen. I am unsure if I'm still broadcasting. I'm okay, all right, good. And then our role in Martha's residency was really to provide her with an office, to provide her with a lot of square footage to lay her work out, and some workspace with tools. And she's the first artist in residency that we've had. We learned a lot along the way, and we're really looking to expand this program as we go forward. The other thing I will say is we are opening to the community June 1st. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we're the first part of the university to reopen, and we are really looking forward to bringing the entire community, especially the artist community, into the building. So please look us up on the internet. Just Google ThinkBox and CWRU and the website will come up. Right.
Maybe now we can pass the mic over to Amanda.
Hi, I'm Amanda Mahoney. I'm Chief Curator of the Dittrick Medical History Center, which is part of the College of Arts and Sciences, also at Case Western Reserve University. Not with us this evening is Jennifer Nieves, the archivist and registrar at the Dittrick, who worked most closely hands-on with Martha. The Dittrick is a very old museum of clinical technology. We were founded about 1894, and we have a lot of mundane, everyday clinical or medical objects. The collection that Martha worked with most closely is the Sky History of Contraception collection, which is, in my opinion, the world's most comprehensive collection of contraceptive technologies. Martha had the opportunity, she was the only researcher that we were able to get access to our collections this year. And we are conducting our first inventory in many decades. And so Martha also got to be around a lot of behind the scenes museum activities, as well as artifacts from our collection that haven't been on view for about a century. And we were also really excited to have an artist work with our collections.
Well, the excitement was really mutual for us too. This was the most we've been involved in, both, you know, having ThinkBox and the Dittrick support one of our artists in residence. It was a new experience for us, and I was really excited for that kind of intersection of research and fabrication. So excitement all around. If there's nothing that anybody else wants to add, I would say we can hand it to you, Martha.
Great. Thank you, Jim, and thank you so much, Amanda. Thanks so much to all of the organizations and people who let me work inside of ThinkBox and the Dittrick, particularly during this difficult COVID moment that we've all found ourselves within. I know that everyone went to a lot of a lot of hard work to allow me access. So I'm incredibly grateful, and the work would not have ended up the way that it has without everyone's support and labor. So I'm really grateful for that. I'm going to share my screen now, if that's all right with you, Layla, and I'll get into the presentation. As I mentioned, if there's any questions or if you can't understand me because of my accent, feel free to drop something into the chat. One thing I will say, I will probably refer to patents quite a bit. I mean patents. So that's just one thing that might be a little confusing for some. So here we go. Alrighty. Okay, can we see my screen? I hope so. So I'll just launch in to the project, but preface it by saying that the work that I've done my entire career has really been focused around design, and I'm actually formally trained in design more than sculpture. And I think for a long time I've attempted to kind of control or use the kind of tactics of control in design, and I'm realizing the more that I make work that the work that I do is really not able to be confined within this kind of line or linearity of control, and that it's actually more about softness and nuance and opportunity for otherness and other interpretation. And so having reflected a lot on the work that I've done over the years, I'm starting to realize that, you know, it's the circle or the spiral or the torus that continues to kind of revolve in and around of my practice. And so above and beyond the specificity of the work that I'm going to show today, that's really how I work. I also am a bit of a digital hoarder, so I've got a lot of slides to get through, but I'll try and breeze through with mundane things that are within our realm of reality, so much so that we kind of forget that they're there. So there's probably going to be a lot of mundane discussions, but I hope that it's interesting, at least in some way, shape, or form. The other way that I like to think about how I work is that I really like to look closer at things, pull them apart, extract them, see them in a variety of different guises, and then make them for myself as a way to understand them. And I do that through artistic practice. And it's kind of my hope that the way that I make work and the way that I try to know something also allows others to come to a kind of personal form of knowing for themselves. So the exhibition on Show It Spaces is around this typology or history of reproductive objects. And just for the purposes of this conversation today, I just want to share my own definition of how I've kind of bookended these objects. They're sort of sitting within the category for my own sense of pessaries. So pessaries being objects of contraception, sterilization, or medicinal and or structural support for the internal architecture of the body. And that internal architecture can include the reproductive or biologically female body, but it also can extend in and out of different categories. I think when I started making this project or started looking at this category of objects in 2018, I was very finite and strict about how I thought about it, sort of, you know, object and body interaction. But through the process of making this work over the last few years, I've begun to discover that it's far more malleable and messy. And that really, that I think about it as an attempt to kind of create a holographic form through seeing the object in a variety of different ways. And so the exhibition itself is split into three, or can be kind of dissected into three different portions. So the first being a map that's drawn on the wall. And this is a map of the history of patented contraceptive and reproductive and pessary objects. The second being a series of castings that are set out on the floor, which I made during my residency in 2020 at the Kohler Arts Industry Residency. And then the third being a new line of inquiry. And that's really work that I made in Cleveland at ThinkBox. And it was really in response to my time investigating the vast object archives at the Dittrick and the Percy Sky collection within the Dittrick. And really, that opportunity was the first time that I've actually been able to physically engage with these objects on my own and in a very direct way, rather than having seen them through a screen, through kind of digital archives. So I'll sort of break down the talk in these three sections. But just quickly, one thing that I have really kind of thought about over and over again is that the act of looking at this kind of history of mundane objects, for me also allows me to think through what it is to make sculpture and what it is to kind of think about the history of representation of the body within the kind of a history of art. So, you know, the IUD and the insertion device and its package, all as a kind of series of objects that are components that link together and that have a relationship, but that also kind of exhibit a sculptural quality. And so this is the Dittrick, or the entrance of the Dittrick at the Allen Memorial Medical Library at Case Western. So I would go here every Wednesday during my 2 months in Cleveland, and it was an incredible privilege to be given access and open up these many grey boxes. So this is like one cupboard, and inside these boxes were many dozens of little plastic containers, all of which have IEDs and catalogue details within them. My messy, although this is fairly clean, but my messy studio at Sears ThinkBox. And so I actually worked at Sears ThinkBox most of the time and used that time to not only think through making new works, but also to do a lot of new metal castings ready for exhibition. So really appreciated the top-notch ventilation in the grinding room. That was a huge gift. So it wasn't just the objects at the Dittrick, but also the texts that I had available. There were just so many things that I never have had access to before. As an artist who researches, I'm not a researcher in the kind of traditional sense. So I've really begun to expand my understanding of this history and to create new ideas around this history. This book, which completely rocked my world, a study by a group at MIT in the 70s who essentially were doing what I've been doing, which is cataloging a history of patented objects. So this is my catalog, which I started working on in 2018. This is a map that basically brings together an object that represents a patented device, and each device is cataloged by year and by typology and by author. Hopefully this video will work, but this will give you a sense of the catalog system that I've crudely designed that's not dissimilar to an exhibition checklist, but sort of allows me to add to it as new patents are uploaded online, and also refer back to these devices. So this is the way in which I've organized it for searching purposes, for my own kind of searching purposes, but then I use this catalog to create maps, and those maps become exhibited in various ways to share with other people. But all of these patents are completely available online through simple Google searches. So just to bookend this patent history, the first one that I found is 581 from 1838, and the most recent from March of 2021. The expectation for what's needed to kind of create a legitimate patent is really expanded over this period. So what was once a kind of 3 or 2 page document has become many, many pages and illustrations. But this is the first and the last patent in my history, at least so far. And so the opportunity to exhibit this work at Spaces was a really amazing one, because I have never had a wall quite so long to allow me to share this vast history. There's about 400 objects in my patent archive. So the entry wall of the exhibition, which is 14 meters, maybe that's 57 feet, allowed me to create a configuration specifically for that wall. It's actually quite difficult to document, which is why I invite everyone to go visit the exhibition. Here are some detail images. So the linear timeline, we can see the length of the wall being the length of time. And then when it expands in height, you have years and moments where there were many patents invented. So the process of installing or creating this wall was done with like as a massive team effort. Here's Mallory, the superstar project coordinator at Spaces, who I think quite enjoyed this fairly meditative process of applying the lines onto the wall. And so everyone at Spaces worked together, I think it was over a period of 10 days, including the members preview, where we had some of the Spaces members come in and contribute their own hand to the wall. So each of the drawings is basically traced around using a carbon paper and a stylus, and in that way it leaves an impression on the wall, not only of the device but of the hand that traced around it. And in this way, for me, I hope that it allows people also kind of to exercise my own perception through making the thing, or to kind of learn and discover through replicating the thing. So here's the rest of the exhibition. On the floor we have the castings, and on the wall we have these new works, which are, you know, new opportunities to think through what it is to kind of understand these objects. And I was really excited that, you know, Spaces really encourages this active experimentation. And for me, that was really great, because it kind of forced me to make work throughout that finite 2-month period, and to find a way to think through what it is to kind of present these ideas that I'm seeing and discovering and learning within the confines of the Dittrick, whilst it was closed to the public. So just to back up a little bit, the only object that is part of the casting set on the ground that wasn't made at the Kohler Arts Industry Residency up in Wisconsin was this bagel or half donut object that you see here. And this is really the object that started it all for me. I was tasked during my MFA at the School of the Art Institute to write a short research paper around the history of material technology. And I don't think that my professor really appreciated what I came up with, but I insisted on writing the history through the typology of reproductive objects, which I'd sort of been interested in for a while for a variety of different reasons. But that was back in 2018, and I discovered during that kind of small exercise that there was an enormous potential to expand on the study and to really think through different ways of looking at this history. One object that stood out to me immediately was this Roman era pessary cast in bronze that's held at the London Science Museum, part of the Wellcome Trust collection. I think it's there on permanent loan, and in fact they hold 2 of these devices. They look pretty much the same. So when I say 2, it's 2 donuts, but each kind of has 2 components to it. The thing that I found most interesting about this, well, there were many things that I found interesting about this device, but one being that its form and its scale still exists on the market today in the form of this pink plastic. And in fact, this torus shape shows up throughout this history. So it just continues to travel through time, and its relevance to the bodies in which it inhabits continues to hold relevance despite, millennia of changes in technology and in culture. So for me, it was kind of staggering to think through how those changes have happened, and that the only thing that really has altered was the material composition of the form. So I reached out to the London Science Museum, and they provided me with further details on the object so that I could myself remake it using the lost wax casting process, which is likely how this was made. So I went through the process of making a 3D model, 3D printing it, and then making a mold so that I could make some wax parts, and so that the wax part can be put inside of a plaster flask, and that plaster flask then is burnt out in the kiln, and it allows for the space in which the wax was once there to be filled with bronze and cast into bronze. So I did this at the School of the Art Institute in the materials lab where I worked during grad school. And this process took, 2 or 3 weeks and was incredibly labor intensive. Getting it to final polish stage with the comforts of modern electricity and technology was still a lot of work, and it really made me think through, the value of these kinds of objects and the labor that would have been involved in creating these forms back then. So, having made it or made a kind of series of these objects, I became really fascinated with its kind of aura and its relevance throughout history. So this object is really where I started casting metal, and it led me to the Kohler Arts Industry residency. I immediately wanted to scale up, and that's probably for a variety of different reasons, but one that I can probably explain through these images is that, as an Australian person who grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, I really have come to understand the world through television and media that's come from places other than the place that I am from. And so TV shows and movies, particularly kids' TV shows and movies, have held resonance in my practice in a way that I find equally as important as the kind of intellectual side of things. So this idea of kind of understanding what it is to experience the world through shifts in scale and the kind of imaginary is incredibly important to the way that I think about making work. So on the left, we have Lion King, where the cubs stumble into the elephant graveyard, and on the right, we have that episode of the Magic School Bus where Miss Frizzle takes the student inside the body of one of the students in the class so that they can kind of discover how the body works. And so this is kind of how I explain or can justify why it was that I wanted to scale up these objects. And in scaling up these objects, I think it's allowing me to at least understand what they do as things that also replicate the body that they're inside. So I think that I'm at once kind of like not only studying the objects, but also thinking about the body and what it is to kind of know those things and to know them through making them. So the castings that I made up at Cola were really in response to these ideas, and hoping to scale them up so that I can confront them myself, scaling them up so that they can become bodies in themselves, but also scaling them up so that we can think about this kind of territory of forms that kind of sit on the abstract plane of intellectual property. So not dissimilar to, this history of the colonized land. I kind of think through the act of colonizing bodies as, academics such as Silvia Federici talk about, particularly with regard to the biologically female body, and what it is to kind of think about these objects as not only inhabiting the bodies, but that, the authors who patent these claims in some way, shape, or form kind of claim authorship and claim a part of this intellectual territory, which is formed through both image and language. So I'm going to share some process images of my time up at Cola. Some of the forms I created using, 3D modeling, and then CNCing them, and then creating patterns from the CNC'd forms, but then going through a variety of other stages in order to get to the final casting. So, in order to make the final casting, you kind of have to make 5 versions of the thing, So I had the pattern, but then I created another set of patterns in plaster using that pattern. And then using that plaster pattern, I then created more patterns or more kind of castings with these sand cast forms or molds, and then would lay clay into the parts in order to create a shell. So and this process of arriving at what I like to call kind of like a shell casting was something that I really discovered through the process of making. So I think it was sort of partially, it's discovery through making, but also kind of realizing that there is opportunity to co-opt the facilities around you in order to make use of what's going on. But also for that to ultimately benefit the practice. So the shell castings kind of, simulate what the Cola foundry does, which is, cast bathtubs and vanities. And so in that way, it's a form that has both an interior and an exterior geometry. So the kind of, the sand that is used, that has the resin within it, reacts best to these kind of shell castings. And so that kind of has also enriched the work. And so each of the castings that are on show at Spaces have a direct relationship either to a specific patent or a sort of broader typology of forms. And so here you have 3 parts or 3 separate cast objects, which are quite simply suspended together and kind of use a kind of tension or gravity against each other to hold itself up. But that this form comes from, looking at one specific pessary, one specific patent in my history or my catalogue of pessaries, looking at not only the illustrations, but also the very poetic language that comes with it, that's used to both describe the object, but to kind of create a form of abstraction so that the inventor is able to claim more space in the kind of intellectual property realm of things. But there are moments or call-outs in the piece of language that are interesting to me, like pressure against the walls, until the mouth closes over the enlarged head of the stem and holds the device in place. So it goes on. I mean, every patent is full of poetic phrases. The Dalkin Shield, obviously being a really important object in this history of things, and also being an object that really altered the way in which the FDA classifies medical objects to this day. So thinking about how language and form have defined each other and have also defined larger systems of kind of categorization. So similar to the torus form, the Dalkin Shield was something that I modeled and then cast after creating a variety of different forms and CNCing it. So I actually decided to cut it in half so that I could kind of defy gravity, and in this way allow visitors to move around the object like it might be a design drawing. So in that way, this idea of kind of dissecting and abstracting the form actually leading to allowing one to know it better. A filthy casting, fresh out of the mold, with a lot of cleanup to be done. Months and months of grinding. So an object that's really important to kind of my experience, something that you actually don't necessarily find in the United States. You know, these objects are all very regional, but the multi-load or the load 375, something that's found more in Oceania and parts of Southeast Asia, to my knowledge, and something that I had thought for a long time had a lineage or a relationship to the Dalkin Shield. And in fact, during my time in the Dittrick, I was able to verify that with the text that they had available. So I made this casting using a technique that I've been trying to develop for about 3 years, or a little longer than 3 years actually now, which involves creating a flat mold, which is then injected with a curing material. And that flat mold is designated by a line. And so in this case, I used the outline of the load 375 illustration. And by injecting it, mold actually expands so that you get a form that is organic but also defined. So I cast this up at Cola, knowing that I thought that it had a relationship to the Dalkin Shield, and then was able to verify it. This idea of the the object and the body kind of falling in on itself is something that I keep going back to. So I've just kind of dropped this in here to remind myself, to share with you all that there is this kind of ongoing poetic relationship with the body of the human that wears these objects, but also that the objects, when defined within the patent, are often defined using limbs, which are kind of taken from the kind of the body. So there is this kind of weird inversion that happens in not only the illustration, but in the text. So Mr. Kafka, also a really interesting character, attempts to claim ownership over a process, not an object, and the process being creating a custom molding of a cervix for each patient. And so I was really interested in that this was kind of exhibiting exactly what I've been trying to do with my own practice. And in this way, I made 3D models. First, I made a 1-to-1 scale, and this was right at the start of my residency at COLA, and then realized that actually making these small parts just didn't make sense with their large production systems. So then once again scaled them up and created these big castings, which are also on show. So I was really lucky to stay up at Kohler for 8 months. The pandemic shut everything down for 2 of those months, and the people at the Kohler company and the John Michael Kohler Art Center allowed me to stay up there and wait it out. So I was there till late August and had a weird 2 months of suspended reality in this very strange and quaint town, in which I spent a lot of time thinking about what I was going to do when I went back in. So it was an incredibly life-changing experience, and one which will forever change the way that I think about making this work. So this little selfie for you. These complex molds I got really excited about creating further towards the end. So replicating these forms and also thinking about the kind of material distinction that the author would define these objects. So they wanted this one made in aluminum or any suitable sanitary material. And so at the Dittrick, for the first time I was able to actually touch and engage with these objects. I took the opportunity to look at a series of forms that were held within a box that had been catalogued under only one number. So like many other historical museums that don't necessarily have the resources to catalogue everything straight away, there'll be many, many objects that have to kind of sit within a set for many years. So I used the opportunity to catalogue these devices in order to create material impressions, and that these impressions become a sort of a different way of seeing these forms. And so I went through the process of tracing them both top down and from a kind of sagittal or side view, and using that side view to create a new collection, and then creating a kind of soft skin with a kind of clay, an oil clay, within which I used to do fiberglass casting using a vacuum pressure technique, and then going through the process of kind of laying this epoxy over the top to create this very glossy finish. And I think in some way I was inspired by a series of these devices that were actually contained within little paper packets, and they'd been held inside the packets for so long that they had these beautiful impressions of the objects. And for me, that kind of displayed what the character of, I don't know, how it might be to imagine these objects inside of a body. Another piece that was made using a set of objects inside of the Dittrick, these devices being an attempt to articulate so-called displacements of the uterus, which is basically just 3 categories of uterus presentation. The same with these Vimeo cups, so making negative impressions so that the collection presented is not the object, but the impression that it might leave on the body. And then finally, this claw type history, which is basically an articulation of what I'd mentioned earlier, the load 375 or the multi-load being a descendant of not only the Dalkin Shield, but the Tatum T. And using the objects that are held within the Dittrick and beyond the Dittrick collection to show a kind of species formation of these objects. So not dissimilar to the mapping that I do, these are sort of dimensional maps. And this was the sort of pattern that I used. And then a kind of clay iteration. I became very invested in using my hands to do kind of soft, quiet work after spending months and months grinding metal. And finally, just finally, I know we're running out of time, but these new works that are far more poetic than I would have ever kind of hoped to make. I feel I'm falling into abstraction, and perhaps that's not such a bad thing, but really looking at these more recent patents that have just pages and pages of illustration and text, so that you can see all of the different ways that these objects exist inside of body and inside of insertion device, and using those lines and those forms to create molds that I then inject into to create these weird organic castings that to me also perform what it is to imagine a hollow organ or the uterus being filled with a variety of kind of interlocutors. I love this one. Turned inwardly to form loops, stressed slightly toward each other so that they have an outward bias. The molding process may provide a flexible web of coating material that joins together the two arms of the element. The surfaces of edges portions are curved so as to provide a sufficient amount of material joining. The formation of a flexible web between the arms of the element with no flaws therein, which might be occasioned by the presence of air. And so that these forms might attempt to kind of perform that in a way that's far more poetic. Thank you. That's me done, Layla.
Thank you, Martha.
Sorry if I talked for too long.
No, that's okay. We have about 10 minutes left. We have a little bit of time for like if anybody has any questions. I haven't received any from the chat, but if anyone has something they want to ask, you can just kind of unmute and say hi. But before we get to that, I kind of wanted to, I guess, open it up to you and Amanda, because I think you have some kind of interesting insight from the historic context of working with Martha. Amanda.
I do. It was really interesting as a historian and a curator to walk in and immediately be able to recognize the silhouette of the Dalkin Shield. I found it so interesting too that, you know, for those of you who don't know, the Dalkin Shield was an IUD, a contraceptive device that was introduced in the US in the early 1970s. It was very popular, and it caused quite a few complications and less than 20 deaths, but about 200,000 recorded cases of complications. And the shape of the IUD is so menacing and insect or crab-like, but it was in fact the string that led from the device through the cervix into the vaginal canal that was the cause of all of the injury. And so even though the shape was not the cause of all of the harm, it was etched in everyone's mind. And here, Martha has further etched it. Well, you didn't etch it out of metal. I know you're very precise about your methodology there. But I really found that really interesting. And I think it explores the materiality of IUDs in a way that I can't do with a label.
Thank you, Amanda. Do we have any questions from our audience? Because if not, we've got one over here.
I came in late, but I'm just hanging out here in the gallery. So I don't know if Martha, you have addressed this in any capacity yet, but I was wondering if you could talk about the decision, like the spatial configuration of the pieces on the floor and sort of the added layer of having the body sort of walk through and interact with with these pieces, and if that was intentional.
Thanks, Claire. Claire Breen, everyone, resident writer, should I say, at Spaces right now. So yeah, I really enjoy giving visitors the opportunity to move through the space and to kind of encounter the objects in a way that they can kind of circulate through. So it was very intentional, and I really deliberated on how that configuration would be displayed. Your question was around how that kind of came to form. I think it came through a lot of kind of play. It wasn't really until I arrived in Cleveland that I was able to set up the work in a space big enough to see it, given how big the castings are and how many there were. And in fact, these aren't all of them. I made a lot more work at Cola, but I just had to kind of make a decision about what would be shown in this exhibition. So having an enormous space at ThinkBox to kind of play with that idea, but also to finally get it into the gallery during the install week allowed me to do that. And I think this idea of I keep going back to this idea of like the holograph, or the kind of the object that is realized through a variety of different modes, and that if we can look at it through a variety of different vantage points, we can understand it better. So in that way, revolving around it, you become kind of like a human gumball or something, but also having the other objects on the wall in terms of the castings, but also the map on the other wall in terms of the timeline, I hope allows people to kind of begin to create that triangulation or that kind of holograph, and so that they can also imagine the shifts in scale that can happen, and that through those shifts in scale, you can begin to kind of transport your body through time and through space. Maybe that's too ambitious of a thing to try and do, but that's kind of how I think through it.
Martha, I'm gonna try to word this as best as I can. I'm curious how you kind of address gender in this work, as in a field where probably for the vast majority of its history was kind of spoken about in a very gender binary way that we are kind of shifting out of. Recently developing a little more language around. So maybe it's not as much a question as it is just an observation. It's something I'm kind of interested in, how you address that, whether it's in your own practice or just in conversation with others that you have about the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also language that I'm still building for myself, or vocabulary that I'm still kind of developing. Just personally, I feel like I'm kind of a body that's continuing to evolve in its own kind of subjectivity. So it's something that I think about a lot. With regard to the typology of pessaries, it actually transcends gender. And I also kind of think through what it is to think about like a biologically categorized body as opposed to a kind of gendered body, but that also those two definitions are also insufficient in defining what it is to kind of think through otherness and nuance and difference. I think that having made this work and been so heavily focused on this typology, I am beginning to kind of get really excited about its opportunity to articulate the nuance of the non-binary. And so I think when I'm making or talking about the work, I'm kind of trying to be careful about trying to use too many gendered terms, because I don't necessarily know that it kind of helps the conversation, nor do I want to necessarily kind of reproduce this patriarchal history from which these objects come. But we can't deny the fact that most of the authors who have written these patents have male names, and that, you know, the history of the Industrial Revolution was kind of led by the male gender. So in that way, we can't really untether that history, but we can, I think, build a future that is kind of more nuanced and open. And then on top of that, I do think that there's a lot of work that's being done around pre-modern histories of gender and labor and care practices that move beyond how we kind of understand modern medicine, right? So there's so much there, and I did think that having made this exhibition, I would be done with this typology, but I've actually just kind of hit the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much more opportunity for exploration. I really want to deep dive into the pre-modern era, and to explore the opportunity to understand the non-object modes of care, and kind of this idea of kind of correction and categorization, and like a form as a kind of like the form of control, for me is kind of like in direct opposition with a kind of, you know, liberation of the body. So I think looking at, you know, oral histories and plant-based knowledges could be a really interesting way to kind of subvert what's happened so far in our kind of modern understanding of what it is to kind of create these objects and to kind of protect or correct these bodies. And I say that in inverted commas because this idea of like protection and correction is so at odds with many things that are kind of important to me, but that also there is no black and white answer to this history. You know, these objects have done wonderful things, but also terrible things to the bodies that have held these objects inside of them. So it's very nuanced. And I mean, that's kind of my intention, right? I don't necessarily want to dictate a position. I really want people to visit and to kind of like discover these objects for themselves, and also to discover like broader ideas around how these forms continue to kind of pervade through time, you know.
But Helen made a note that Helen had to run, but they said your work is so fascinating. Can't wait to see where you take it next. I also love the Magic School Bus reference. And Martha, you did answer the final question I had for you was kind of what's next and where do you want to dive into your research next? So thank you for touching on that. And then Ruth says, I just wanted to thank Martha for being so open and welcoming during her time at ThinkBox. Thank you, Ruth. And I see Uno has a question.
Hi, sorry, quick last minute question for you, Martha. I know that before, like when you were working on your thesis, you had been doing a lot of work in silicone, and then you had moved to metal casting, which obviously, you know, displayed your degrade effect. But I was interested in the fiberglass pieces and knowing the importance of material choice in your work. Like what drove that specific pivot?
Thanks, Juno. That's a great question. It is an attempt to continue replicating industrial kind of methods of production. Not that fiberglass is necessarily directly related to this typology, but I've been thinking recently about like my relationship to the materials that I use and like how ecologically concerning those materials are from a kind of you know, futurist perspective. Thinking just about, you know, the use of resources and materials that are not necessarily in line with the way in which I want kind of to imagine my future on this planet. However, so with that in mind, I have been thinking about how there is an opportunity in art making to use techniques and materials that are relevant to what's going on within, you know, your kind of like subject or focus, as a kind of as a, like a time capsule for past and future. And so in that way, I kind of was interested in fiberglass. On top of that, the fiberglass casting that I made in Cleveland is really the beginning of me thinking through what it is to create an impression of a thing, but I kind of want to do it at scale. So I've started developing it, but it's taking a bit of time to kind of perfect. But my goal is to begin creating a kind of series of negative impressions of what was past. Those negative impressions kind of form a continuation of this idea of the kind of body object relationship, but in a kind of more abstracted way. The reason why fiberglass as a material was kind of important was because I was initially thinking about the fiberglass as an opportunity to physically support these metal castings as a display mechanism, and that fiberglass or carbon fiber is kind of strong enough to support what is kind of like 50 to 100 pound pieces. That's kind of where it came from. And like, as with everything that I do, I'll start kind of up here and then I kind of like deviate in 1,000 different ways and the work kind of splinters off. So for me, it's kind of about like my practice is really about kind of a hybrid method of like research and making and kind of continually bouncing between these two things. And so the research is sometimes in the making, and sometimes it kind of splinters off and changes course. But that's where it really came from. And I'm not sure that it was necessary, but also this vacuum molding technique also for me kind of displays this character of kind of like creating form without necessarily a mold, which is what I was doing at Cola. And I think I'm more interested in making sculpture that really derives from industrial and design methods rather than from more sculpture methods.
Thank you, Martha. So we will wrap up here if nobody else, if Martha or our Dittrick and ThinkBox crew have nothing else to add. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you all again for being here. Thank you for walking us through your practice and your project.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. It's been wonderful. So really appreciate it.